Hello, and welcome to Sproutlogic Gardening. My name is Mike, and today we begin our mini-series on preparing for spring. So I think preparation is one of the best things we can do when it comes to this time of year. Currently, right now, it's January. We're locked pretty deep in the middle of winter. And so what we can do now is get ready for the spring season. Now that's going to reduce the stress, the pressure we feel typically. I know myself when I'm getting ready for spring, I usually start much later in the season, as in like February, March, and I tend to start getting anxiety. Frankly, it's trying to figure out, where do I need to put things? Where do I need to start now? What to do? And so the idea behind this series is getting you prepared ahead of time, so it's a lot less stressful. We remove as many mistakes as we can ahead of time, and then we start just seeing the fruits of our labors. So this can be applied to any person who's going to be setting up a new garden. Maybe you want to redo the layout of your garden, or maybe you're adding new things to your garden. So this series is going to help you plan ahead, get ready as we move into spring. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at when it comes to planting a garden is the sun. So depending on your space and where you have your garden placed, a lot of times, for example, like I'll use my garden, which I lovingly call Short Meadow, kind of named after Monty Don's. It's a play on it. I get it. Not as grand or as wonderful as his, but we're working on it. My garden's on the east side facing of my home. So what that basically means for me is I'm going to receive sun in the morning. During this winter, I get a little bit of sun in the morning, probably by about 12, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Shadows are cast across most of the back garden here, and things will be plunged into the shadow at that point. In the summer, it's a bit different. So east facing for me, I get morning sun, and then I'll receive sun probably all the way up until about 4 or 5 in the afternoon when the sun kind of goes beyond the peak of my home, and then the garden no longer will receive that sunlight, or very little in comparison, not direct light. So depending on where your garden is placed, this is important to know. So we know that north is going to be, you receive the most sun out of everyone typically. South is going to be less sun for sure, probably the least out of both. And then of course, east, you get morning sun, west, you get afternoon sun. So when people talk about planting their garden, they typically want to aim for that north side. Of course, I get it, but we don't all get to choose where that happens depending on where you live. And there's pros and cons really to all of them. Something to keep in mind also is the sun's path of how it travels. So this is very seasonally based when we think about it, right? In the winter, the sun is much lower in the horizon, which means bigger shadows. It means less sunlight. So even if you have a greenhouse, for example, you have to account for that during the winter time. Summer, we get the most sun, right? It's higher up. And like I said, for my garden in particular, we do get a lot more sun, and I still get sun all the way into the evening time usually until it crosses the threshold of the roof of my house and kind of moves on throughout the horizon. So these are very important when planting your garden. You have to keep this in mind. And I'll give you an example also with looking at my garden. So while I'm east facing, there's different sections of the garden that have different things that happen to it. So the next section I'm going to show you actually is going to be my south facing part of the garden. So welcome to the south part of my garden. It's pretty dark over here. You can tell with the shadows, right, in comparison to where I was at. In the previous part of my video, I was facing basically to the west, but standing on the eastern side of my garden. So looking at the shadows, if I was to show you right now, it basically goes more than halfway across my garden in the backyard. So it is quite dark over here and does not receive a lot of light, especially in the wintertime. You'll notice I have something potted over there and protected for winter. That's a hydrangea. And I typically keep it over here because in the summertime, the line of light that I actually get, the shadow's much smaller, hugs right along here. And so I get light. And hydrangeas, typically where I live, they don't do really well in that direct sun, especially for a long period of time. It'll get a pinch of that morning sun, tiny bit of afternoon, and then by the later in the evening or even late in the afternoon, the sun's kind of gone. It's not getting hit by it. This is important with placement, right? Plants that prefer partial shade or they only want a little bit of sunlight, this is where they're going to live. Now, for some gardeners, we can look at this and go, this is a trouble spot. What am I going to do with this space? I can't really plant things there. Not necessarily true. You really can't see it in the frame, but towards the very back on the fence there, I have 2 ferns that I planted last year. Ferns typically love shade. So if you're having trouble figuring out what to do with the shaded part of your garden, you could use it to rotate things that need partial sun, or maybe they call for full sun, but where you live it's too intense. You could place them out during the day in the sun, maybe in the morning, a little bit in the afternoon, and then rotate them into the shaded area, or plant accordingly. Plant things that will grow in the shade happily and not have any problem are low maintenance. I mean, think about flowers. If I don't just want to plant ferns, I want to go into flowers. Geraniums are usually a good option depending on the type. They do prefer more of a woodland environment, and they prefer that shade. So when looking at my garden and planting, I know this is what I'm going to use the space for. These trees cast a pretty large shade, and I have to account for that. Next, let's look at another really unique area of my garden, and one that I find to be probably a little more troublesome than this. So let's take a look. Okay, so welcome to the north side of my garden. Now, this is a very unique spot in my garden, and this is why I tell you it's important to keep an eye on your layout, right? I'm east facing. This is the northern part, but I have a gap between homes with my neighbor. And so what I actually get is beyond full sun. So as the sun is setting during the summertime, I get direct sun here until it goes down. So what that means, any plants, these beds in particular you see back here, will receive sun way longer throughout the day, 12 plus hours depending on the season, especially when we're talking summer, of course, versus the other garden beds you might have seen in the background, maybe on the east end of my garden or the west end of my garden. They're going to receive a lot less compared to this spot over here. So I have to account for that, right? I have to make sure that I'm monitoring these plants. Whatever I want to plant there, it loves a lot of sun and is really resistant to getting burned or dry conditions, because this area will dry out a lot faster typically than the rest of my garden. So when we're talking about planting and we're talking about the movement of the sun, we also got to keep in mind that every area is unique. Every garden's unique. So, if you're surrounded by buildings that are tight up against you, probably more of the older rules will come into play. You'll get that morning sun. If you're on the east side, then it goes away. But that's not always the case, right? When it comes to a garden, we got to make sure that we're keeping an eye on what the sun is doing across the horizon, what's the season, and of course, unique conditions located in the garden. One little thing I forgot to mention before I dove into the sun part of this, when we think about sun and we think about the placement of your garden, there's certain things that we got to think about too when it comes to if you're planting in an open field and there's nothing around you, you're getting full sun all day. That's going to be winter, that's going to be summer, right? So these things may not necessarily apply to you. If you're planting in the middle of an open field, I don't think you really have to worry about that. The path of the sun's not going to be affecting you. If you're tucked up against the forest, you're tucked up against the house, a barn, different story. So that pretty much covers it when it goes into talking about the sun and the movement of things. Let's dive into soil next. Okay, so the next phase of planting on our garden is soil. This is extremely important, and frankly, we can just call it the foundation right next to the sun. So it depends on what kind of soil you have in your garden. And this is really important to know. You need to understand if you're going to be planting directly in the ground, what exactly will your plants be interacting with? So one thing to kind of notate here is, I'll give you my garden as an example here at Short Meadow. It's clay. Heavy, heavy, heavy clay. It drains extremely slow. Water will typically sit on the surface for quite some time. Not many plants really like that. You could argue maybe some wildflowers and stuff like that really enjoy that type of soil. So when I'm planting, if I'm going to plant directly in the ground, I really need to be cognizant of that, which is why you see like the raised beds. So I'll plant with potting mixed soil or raised bed mixed soil, so I can pretty much have whatever I want there without being affected directly by the ground. So in gardening, we have probably three primary types of soil we deal with. So we have that heavy clay or clay, loamy, which is going to be your typical, that's a real healthy, good mix, good draining. It's a good balance between, clay and then moving into sand. So sandy soil, that's going to drain very quickly, doesn't hold moisture, so the retention's a lot less. So those are going to be the three types of soil that most of us have to work with. Now, some gardens have a mix of this, right? So you might have a corner of the garden that's sandy, you might have a middle part that's clay, you might have a part that's loamy. Unfortunately for me, it's clay, solid clay across the board. So I know that for my garden planning, I need to think about that and I need to plan accordingly and use raised beds, whether they're above ground, the ones that are like you see in the background over there, or if it's laying directly on the ground, there's 12 to 18 inches of soil above that. So when the roots get down to the clay side, they're still getting what they need from the raised bed. So this is another important thing to think about when you're talking about your garden, you're planning for spring. What kind of soil do you have? What do you have to work with? Do you need to amend it? Do you need to add compost to it? Do you need to break it up if it's not free draining? I could use this soil in theory, but it would just require a lot of work. I'd have to till the ground, add some sort of ability to give it drainage with perlite or things like that, and probably add compost as well, because nutrients, we could argue, are probably pretty low in this area. So that pretty much covers it when we're talking about soil. The next thing we talk about is the movement of water in your garden. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so the next part of our planning when it comes to looking at our garden, and again, we're just observing, we're making sure we understand what we have to work with so we can plan going forward, is going to be water and how it moves through our garden. Here at Short Meadow, I already mentioned this is clay. So I have very heavy clay, which means that water tends to sit on the surface, or if it rains hard enough, I get a river running down the center of my yard going into my neighbor's yard. Some areas are worse than others. So I showed you the south facing side of my garden. That arguably is probably the worst area where water will sit. It's so bad, in fact, sometimes it literally kills the grass I have over there because the water sits for so long. If I get a good rain combined with that shade, water can stay there for 3 days easily at the surface and it'd be completely waterlogged and soaked. I can't even mow half the time over there when it's really wet. There's times in the summer where I just leave a giant patch of grass because I know as soon as I go into it, my mower's going to get stuck and it's going to look horrible. So this is important to note. I have that hydrangea over there, but it's in a pot. So it's off the ground. It's not going to be affected by that water. It won't get messed up when we're talking about that. But let's look at this east side of my garden here, right? This is something to note and this is important. When we're looking at this area here, what's the first thing you notice? It's on a hill. So when it rains, water will naturally come down this hill. And basically around my entire garden, except for the north facing side, is a bit at a slant coming down. This is like a bowl almost when we look at my garden placement. So there's some advantages to that. I get sheltered from the wind, sometimes the worst temperatures and weather. If I have a severe thunderstorm roll through here, my stuff isn't normally affected down over here. Over there on the end, sometimes depending. Plus, I get sheltered from a lot of the plants and trees you see kind of around the perimeter of my garden. But water gets all focused right here where I'm standing and then flows right down into my neighbor's yard. How could I fix this? Well, if I wanted to, I could do something like installing a French drain right down the center, starting from that south side, going south to north. Focus the water and bring it all the way down through here and get it out of the yard. Not going to do that right now, something to think about, but still good to kind of plan these things out for maybe future projects. So I have a full understanding of what I'm looking at, and I'm combining that with the knowledge of my soil. So this is important for you as well, right? What kind of water do you receive every year? Maybe what seasons are heavier with water, rainfall, things like that. Do you have a pond? Do you have a lake? Do you have a stream? All these things can affect planning your garden and the layout of what you're looking to do. So that pretty much covers it when we're talking about water here. I again encourage you to look at things like rainfall. That's very important, how many inches you receive. And also look at things like seasonality when it comes to you have drier times of the year versus wetter times of the year. Super important. Next, let's talk about maybe planning where we're going to put raised beds, pathways, and things like that. Okay, so we're talking about planning where to put beds and where things should go, like paths and stuff. I wanted to give you a quick little preview of Short Meadow. No judgment, please. It's winter. It's looking kind of rough. But this is essentially the space that I have to work with, right? Got my raised beds over there. I have some potted plants, a raised bed there. That new one I set up a while ago in the last video. I got some on the east facing side, peach tree. And then, of course, I have this shaded area, right? So if I'm thinking about this garden, would I want to put a pathway down here through the middle? Oh, no, definitely not. What we're talking about there is going to be the water problem, right? Unless I install some sort of a drain, I'm going to have some serious issues when it comes to that. Raised beds, where do I want to put them? That north facing side we talked about is amazing. That I get the most sunlight right there, right? So anything that really enjoys a hot amount of sun, a heavy amount of sun, that's the spot for it. Things that require that full sun will thrive over there. Sometimes it's a little too much and I have to be careful, right? And it'll burn things. On this east side here, they actually these beds get shade from the fence and from my neighbor's house over there. So it gets morning sun a little bit. It doesn't actually get sun probably until the more like 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. Of course, this is winter, so right now it's looking kind of dark across the entire yard. But that's something where you things that enjoy partial sun or even maybe full sun that are okay with getting maybe 6 hours versus the 8 to 12. That would be the spot I want to place them. And then, of course, as I talked about, this is the shaded spot. This is going to be things that really enjoy shade, partial shade, or I want to use this as a space to transfer things between the more sunny side to a shaded side, depending on its needs. Now, when planning out paths, what we want to look at in particular is going to be where do I want to put things? Where do I want to walk between things? That's important to note when we're looking at the garden here. So, for example, I have behind me is my patio. I could create a path coming from there, walking through and around, and I'd probably keep it tighter to the house, and then going along in between my raised beds and maybe coming up along the side there. Just a thought, right? But I also have to understand that that path would require maintenance, probably weeding, and also reduce the amount of where I could plant things, depending, right? It depends on what you want to do. If that's not your thing, you're more worried about raised beds, we kind of know already based on my layout what you'd want to think about doing or how you want to handle things. So this is just kind of taking a step back. We're looking at the layout of the garden, where should things go, and what do I want to add to it. This is all part of that planning phase, right? Super important to take a moment just to think about those things when we're talking about gardening. Okay, so we talked about a lot today. This is probably a little bit longer of a video that I've made, but it's important. But one thing you notice that we didn't do is talk about plants. We didn't talk about what we're going to plant, where we're going to plant it, really, maybe a little bit of that. But we didn't even cover that topic. That's because we're not ready for that yet. For me, the first phase is observation. What do I have? What do I got to work with? What's the conditions I have to work with? Once we figure that out, then we can really talk about what to plant, where to plant it, and how to get it done. So thank you for joining me in this video. Please like and subscribe if you like this content, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take it easy.